What happens when a family decides that outsiders are the enemy? When brothers look at their own sisters and see not siblings but wives? In the hills of Kentucky, 1854, two brothers made a choice that would curse their bloodline for generations. And tonight, I'm going to tell you exactly what that choice created. The truth isn't just disturbing, it's a warning about what happens when isolation becomes obsession, when family becomes everything, and when the outside world becomes the enemy. Because what grew in those Kentucky hills wasn't just a family tree, it was a twisted vine that strangled every child born into it. Welcome back to Shadow Stories, where we dig into the secrets that history tried to bury. I'm here with the bravest souls who aren't afraid to stare into the darkness and ask the hard questions. Tonight's story isn't for everyone. It's only for those with the courage to face what happens when humanity goes wrong. If that's you, hit subscribe right now and comment your location below, because we're about to enter territory that most people can't handle. Picture this: Eastern Kentucky, 1854. The mountains stretch endlessly, thick with fog that never seems to lift. Up in those hills where the nearest neighbor is a day's ride away, families live by their own rules. The smell of wood smoke hangs heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of rotting leaves and something else. Something you can't quite name but makes your skin crawl. The Fugate family has been there for decades, hidden in a valley so remote that most maps don't even mark it. They've built something that outsiders don't understand. They've built a world where the only people you can trust are the ones who share your blood. Where the only safe choice for a wife is someone who already calls you brother. The isolation isn't just geographical, it's mental. These mountains have become a prison where twisted ideas grow like poisonous mushrooms in the dark. The wind through the trees sounds like whispers, carrying secrets that would make normal people run screaming. But the Fugates aren't normal people anymore. They haven't been for a long time. And as you stand at the edge of their property, looking up at those dark windows and smoke-stained chimneys, you can feel it. Something is very wrong here. Martin Fugate and Zachariah Fugate aren't just brothers. They're the guardians of what they believe is family purity. Look at them from a distance, and you see respected mountain men, strong shoulders from years of hard work, calloused hands that know how to survive in harsh country. Their neighbors nod with respect when they pass. These are serious men who pay their debts and mind their own business. But look closer, and you'll see something that makes your stomach turn. The way they watch their own sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, isn't brotherly. It's possessive, hungry. They don't see the sin that the outside world would scream about. They see perfect wives, women who understand their ways, who won't bring outside poison into their sacred bloodline, women who will help them build something that will last forever. Martin's eyes have a cold intelligence behind them, the look of a man who has thought this through and decided he's smarter than God himself. Zachariah follows his older brother's lead, but there's something more desperate in his gaze. He knows what they're doing is wrong, but he's too weak to stop it. Together they've convinced themselves that their twisted love is actually purity. The story they told the world was simple, almost boring. The Fugate brothers had married local girls from neighboring families. Good mountain women who understood the hard life of the hills, who could birth children and tend crops without complaint. When strangers passed through and asked about their wives, the brothers had their story ready. They'd met these women at church gatherings, courted them properly, and married them in small ceremonies with just family present. Nothing unusual about that. Mountain folk kept to themselves and their own kind. When people noticed that their wives seemed unusually shy, barely speaking when visitors came around, the brothers would chuckle. Mountain women are modest, they'd explain. They don't trust outsiders. When someone pointed out how much the wives resembled the Fugate brothers themselves, Martin would laugh and slap the person on the back. All us mountain folk look alike after enough generations. We're all cousins up here anyway. It was a lie so simple, so believable, that most people accepted it without question. After all, who would suspect something so horrible? Who would want to believe that respected family men could be capable of something so twisted and evil? But the truth was hidden in the carefully built isolation of their compound. The Fugate brothers had created something that went far beyond a simple homestead. They'd built a fortress of secrecy, and every detail had been planned. Multiple cabins connected by covered walkways, hidden from the main trail by thick stands of pine trees that blocked the view from any direction. Storage rooms filled with supplies meant to last through any emergency or any investigation. Root cellars that went deeper than any family needed, with hidden chambers that served purposes no decent person could imagine. The most important building was separate from the others, connected only by an underground tunnel. This was where the births happened, where no outside midwife would ever be welcome. The windows were boarded up, the door locked from the outside. Inside, the walls were thick enough to muffle any sound. This wasn't just a home, it was a prison designed to keep secrets buried and victims silent. The brothers had spent years perfecting their fortress, making sure that what happened inside would stay inside forever. They called it their sanctuary. Anyone else would call it what it really was, a chamber of horrors. When visitors asked why the Fugate children rarely came to town, why they seemed so odd when they did appear, the explanations came as easily as breathing. Mountain air makes children different, Martin would say with a concerned shake of his head. They grow up slow, but they grow up strong. When a child stumbled while walking or struggled to form simple words, Zachariah would jump in. They're just shy around strangers. City folks make them nervous. If someone noticed unusual physical features, skin that looked almost blue in certain light, limbs that didn't seem to work quite right, the brothers had ready answers. They take after their mothers, who come from delicate stock. Some families just have their own look. The community accepted these explanations because the alternative was too horrible to consider. These were God-fearing people who went to church on Sundays and helped their neighbors during harvest time. The idea that children could be suffering right under their noses, that evil could wear such a normal face, was beyond what most folks could handle. So they chose to believe the lies. They chose not to see what was right in front of them. And that choice made them partners in the horror that was growing in those hills. Dr. Samuel Morrison was the one man who should have seen the truth, should have stopped what was happening before it spiraled into a tragedy too deep to mend. As the traveling physician serving the isolated mountain communities, he delivered many of the Fugate children over the years. He saw the deformities that made his hands shake, twisted limbs, misshapen skulls, eyes that seemed to plead for answers he couldn't give. He noted the strange colorations that shouldn't exist in nature, skin tinged with unnatural hues, and the children who struggled to breathe, to speak, or even to hold up their own heads. His medical training left no room for doubt. These were the unmistakable signs of severe inbreeding, a genetic quagmire that screamed for intervention. Yet Dr. Morrison was also a man tethered to his reputation, his safety, and the fragile piece of his existence in these rugged hills. The first time he dared to probe, asking cautious questions about family trees, about how closely related the parents might be, Martin Fugate took him aside for a private conversation. The words exchanged were never repeated, but when Dr. Morrison emerged, his hands trembled violently, and his face was white as chalk. From that day forward, he delivered the babies, collected his payment, and kept his mouth shut. He told himself he was being practical, that one man couldn't unravel a web of tradition woven over generations. He convinced himself that his silence preserved the delicate balance of trust he'd built with the community, that speaking out would only bring chaos without change. But late at night, when sleep eluded him, the truth gnawed at his conscience like a relentless fever. He was a coward who had sold his soul to keep himself safe. Each new birth, each new child bearing the same cursed traits, was a mirror held up to his failure. He could have written to the state medical BOA, could have sought help from colleagues in distant cities, but he didn't. Fear of Martin Fugate, of the community's wrath, of his own irrelevance, kept him tethered to silence. In the quiet of his small cabin, surrounded by medical texts that mocked his inaction, Dr. Morrison would pour himself a whiskey and stare into the fire, knowing he was complicit in a slow generational tragedy. He had the knowledge to act, the duty to intervene, but lacked the courage to face the consequences. And so the Fugate legacy continued, each new child a testament to his betrayal of the oath he'd sworn to uphold. The real victims in this story weren't just the wives who had no choice in their fate, though their suffering could shatter the hardest heart. Bound by tradition and fear, they endured lives of quiet despair, their voices silenced by a community that saw their pain as inevitable. But the true tragedy fell upon the children, born into a world where their parents were also their aunt and uncle, where their genetic code was twisted from the moment of conception. These innocent souls bore physical marks that set them apart from any normal family you've ever seen. The blue-tinted skin became the Fugate family's most visible curse, a haunting hue that drew whispers and stares, but it was far from the worst of their burdens. Some children were born with limbs that wouldn't grow properly, bones that curved in impossible, agonizing directions. Others had internal organs that barely functioned, hearts that stuttered with every weak beat, lungs that gasped for air that never came in full. The lucky ones bore only mild learning disabilities, their speech slurred and halting, making them strangers in their own conversations. The unlucky ones lived their entire short lives in constant pain, unable to walk, talk, or even feed themselves, their existence a fragile thread fraying under the weight of their inherited flaws. Yet perhaps the cruelest part was the prison of secrecy that confined them. From birth they were taught that the outside world was evil, a place of judgment and betrayal, and that only family could be trusted. They grew up believing their suffering was normal, that every child endured such afflictions. They had no inkling that their parents had chosen to create them this way, weaving a legacy of pain through deliberate, unspoken decisions. The children's world was a shadowed hollow where questions were forbidden and the truth was buried beneath layers of loyalty, appel, and fear. They played in the same dusty yards where their parents had played, unaware that their games were shadowed by a cycle of harm. Each malformed limb, each labored breath, was a testament to a tradition that prized isolation over humanity. The Fugate children, with their fragile bodies and trusting hearts, carried the weight of their family's choices, their lives a quiet cry for a freedom they would never know. They were not just victims of biology, but of a silence that refused to break, a community that turned its back on the possibility of change, leaving them to bear the cost of secrets kept for generations. Sarah Jenkins was just 16 when she stumbled across the truth that would haunt her forever. A traveling seamstress who journeyed to the Fugate compound to mend clothes and assist with domestic tasks. Sarah was young enough to be curious, but old enough to grasp the gravity of what she overheard. She was working in the main cabin, her needle moving steadily through a torn shirt, when Martin Fugate's voice cut through the thin walls, cold and unyielding, as he disciplined one of his children in the next room. "Don't you ever forget," he said, his tone sharp with conviction. "Your mama is my sister, and that makes our blood pure. Anyone who says that's wrong is trying to destroy our family." Sarah's hands froze on the fabric, her breath catching in her throat. The child's response was even more chilling, delivered with the innocent certainty of youth. "Yes, Papa, and when I grow up, I'll marry my sister too, won't I?" Martin's reply was immediate, resolute. "That's right, boy. That's how we keep our family strong." Sarah felt her stomach churn, a wave of nausea rising within her. She'd heard whispers about mountain families and their peculiar customs, tales swapped in hushed tones by other travelers, but this was beyond anything she'd imagined. This wasn't mere ignorance. It was a deliberate, planned horror, passed down from father to son with chilling intent. The weight of what she'd heard pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Sarah's mind raced as she sat there, her needle idle, the shirt forgotten in her lap. She thought of the children she'd seen in the compound, pale, fragile, some with eyes that seemed too old for their years, others with limbs that didn't move as they should. She'd dismissed the signs as misfortune, perhaps poor nutrition or the harshness of mountain life, but now the pieces fell into place, forming a grotesque picture she couldn't unsee. The Fugates weren't just isolated, they were willfully entrenching a cycle of suffering, binding their children to a legacy of pain under the guise of family purity. Sarah wanted to flee, to run from the cabin and never return, but her legs felt heavy, rooted by fear and disbelief. She knew speaking out could bring trouble. Martin's tone had carried a warning that extended beyond the child. Yet, as she stared at the thread in her hands, she wondered if silence would make her complicit in this grim tradition, a witness to a truth she could neither forget nor fully escape. The trauma of what Sarah heard that day changed her forever, carved itself into her memory like words etched in stone. She fled the Fugate compound that very evening, not even waiting for her payment, running through the dark woods with tears streaming down her face. Her heart pounded as branches clawed at her skirts, each step driven by the desperate need to escape the chilling truth she'd overheard. But when she reached town and tried to tell people what she'd discovered, she learned a bitter lesson about what happens when you speak a truth no one wants to hear. "That's impossible," the shopkeeper declared, shaking his head with a scoff. "The Fugate brothers are respected men. They wouldn't do something like that." The pastor at the local church was even harsher, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Mountain girls get strange ideas," he said with a dismissive wave, probably just jealous she couldn't catch a husband herself. Even the women she'd once called friends turned their backs, their voices dripping with scorn. Sarah Jenkins always was a troublemaker, they whispered behind cupped hands, making up wild stories to get attention. Within a week, Sarah found herself branded a liar and an outcast. The townsfolk's disbelief was a wall she couldn't breach, their loyalty to the Fugates an unspoken pact rooted in fear or willful ignorance. No one would hire her for sewing work. Her once steady hands, skilled with needle and thread, now trembled with frustration and shame. People crossed the street to avoid her, their glances heavy with judgment, as if her words had tainted her very presence. The isolation was suffocating, a second wound layered atop the horror she'd witnessed. Sarah's nights were haunted by the memory of that child's voice, so innocently pledging to continue the family's grim tradition, and the realization that her truth was a burden she'd carry alone. She packed her few belongings and left town under the weight of that terrible secret, her footsteps heavy with the knowledge that no one would believe her. Each mile she walked carried her further from the life she'd known, but not from the guilt that gnawed at her. Guilt for failing to make them listen, for failing to protect those children trapped in a cycle of suffering. Sarah had seen the truth, raw and undeniable, but the world had closed its eyes, leaving her to wander with a story that burned in her chest, unspoken, unheeded, and unforgettable. When pressure finally mounted for someone to investigate the disturbing rumors about the Fugate family, Sheriff Tom Bradley made a great show of conducting an official inquiry. He stood tall at the town meeting, his voice booming with promises of duty and justice, vowing to uncover the truth behind the whispered tales. He rode up to the compound with great fanfare, his deputy trailing behind, both men armed and ready for whatever they might find, or so it seemed. Their horses kicked up dust along the mountain trail, a spectacle that drew eyes from every corner of town. But Sheriff Bradley spent exactly 2 hours at the Fugate compound, and those who saw him return noted the easy set of his shoulders, the relaxed smile that didn't match the gravity of his task. His report to the gathered townspeople was brief and final. "Nothing unusual is happening up there, just a hard-working family trying to make an honest living in difficult circumstances." The words fell like a gavel, silencing the murmurs of doubt. What the sheriff didn't mention was the bag of silver coins that had changed hands during his visit, heavy enough to pay off his debts and buy his wife the fine house in town she'd been longing for. Nor did he speak of the chilling threats delivered in low, deliberate tones, promises of harm to his family if anyone dared come asking questions again. The investigation was closed before it truly began, a hollow gesture wrapped in the pretense of duty. Bradley returned to his office, the clink of coins in his pocket a secret rhythm to his steps. He told himself he'd done what was best, that stirring up trouble with the Fugates would only bring chaos to a town already stretched thin. Yet, in the quiet moments when he sat alone with his thoughts, the weight of those coins grew heavier, a reminder of the truth he'd buried. He avoided the eyes of townsfolk who still whispered about the Fugates, their suspicions undeterred by his flimsy report. He avoided the mirror too, where his own reflection seemed to judge him. The sheriff had seen the children up there, pale, frail, with eyes that held a quiet suffering, but he'd turned away, choosing comfort over courage. The Fugates' secrets remained untouched, shielded by a man who wore a badge but lacked the resolve to uphold it. And so the mountain kept its silence, and the town settled back into uneasy ignorance, while Bradley carried the stain of his compromise, a debt no amount of silver could ever repay. But the children themselves were walking proof of the horror that lived in those hills, living evidence that couldn't be bought off or threatened into silence. As they grew older and occasionally appeared in town for supplies or medical care, people couldn't help but notice the strange ways they moved. Their gait was different, like they were always fighting against their own bodies. They had difficulty with normal speech, words slurring together in ways that made them hard to understand. Most disturbing of all, they flinched when strangers looked at them too closely, as if they'd been trained to fear outside attention. Their bodies told the story their parents tried so desperately to hide. Some walked with unusual gaits, their bones not formed quite right, spines that curved in painful directions. Others had facial features that seemed to blend and blur in disturbing ways, eyes too close together or too far apart, mouths that couldn't quite close properly. All of them carried the unmistakable mark of a bloodline that had been poisoned by its own twisted logic. When they tried to interact with normal children their age, the differences became even more obvious. The most disturbing discovery came when local teacher Martha Whitfield tried to educate some of the older Fugate children, hoping to give them a fragile tether to the normal world. She quickly realized these weren't just shy mountain children or slow learners grappling with basic education. These were young people whose minds had been shaped by generations of genetic damage, their brains as twisted as their frail, misshapen bodies. Simple concepts that other children grasped with ease, counting apples, reading short sentences, left them confused and frustrated, their faces crumpling in defeat. They couldn't understand basic math, their minds stumbling over numbers as if they were foreign objects. Lessons taught one day vanished by the next, their memories like sieves that held nothing. They struggled to make connections between ideas that seemed obvious to others, their thoughts tangled in a fog of inherited limitations. When Martha introduced stories about families unlike their own, the children grew agitated, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. When she gently explained that most people marry outside their family, that brothers and sisters don't become husband and wife, the room erupted in chaos. The children's denial was fierce, almost violent, their voices rising in defense of the only truth they'd ever known. Most horrifying of all, they had been taught to see their situation not as abuse or horror, but as a sacred duty to preserve family purity. They spoke of their future marriages to their siblings with a chilling reverence, their voices carrying the same bright anticipation other children reserved for Christmas or birthdays. To them, the twisted bonds that defined their family were a badge of honor, a covenant to uphold. Martha's heart sank as she listened, her chalk trembling in her hand. She saw not just the damage to their bodies, crooked limbs, pale skin tin, shed with unnatural hues, but the deeper wound to their minds, shaped by a doctrine that glorified their suffering. She tried to reach them, to plant seeds of a broader world, but each attempt was met with resistance, as if her words threatened the very foundation of their existence. The Fugate children were prisoners of a legacy they couldn't comprehend, bound by a loyalty that twisted love into something grotesque. Martha left the schoolhouse each day with a heaviness she couldn't shake, haunted by the realization that these children, with their broken minds and fervent beliefs, were not just victims, but unwitting disciples of a tradition that had stolen their chance at a life beyond the mountain's shadow. Enter Rebecca Morrison, Dr. Samuel Morrison's daughter, a young woman who would become the unlikely hero in this story of generational horror. Unlike her cowardly father, Rebecca couldn't be bought off, threatened, or intimidated into silence. She was a woman who had trained as a nurse in Louisville before returning to help her aging father with his mountain practice. She'd seen the wider world, worked in real hospitals with real doctors, and understood exactly what she was looking at when she examined the Fugate children. Rebecca knew that the pattern of deformities, the specific types of genetic damage, the learning disabilities and physical abnormalities could only come from one source: years of systematic inbreeding. She was also young enough to be angry about it and brave enough to do something dangerous. Rebecca had grown up hearing whispers about the strange mountain families, but she'd always assumed they were just stories meant to scare children. Now she knew better. Now she knew that sometimes the most horrible stories are true, and someone has to be brave enough to expose them. Rebecca began her investigation quietly and carefully, knowing that one wrong move could get her killed or worse. She moved with the caution of someone treading on thin ice, aware that the Fugate brothers' influence reached far beyond their isolated compound. She started documenting every case she encountered, sketching the children's deformities in detailed medical drawings, limbs bent at unnatural angles, skulls misshapen, eyes clouded with unspoken pain. With the precision of a trained professional, she noted their developmental delays, the halting speech, the inability to grasp simple tasks, the vacant stares that betrayed minds struggling to keep pace. Most importantly, she began mapping out the true family tree that the Fugate brothers had worked so hard to conceal from the outside world. Working late into the night by flickering candlelight in her small, drafty room, she pieced together a case that would expose the grim truth festering in those isolated hills. Her notes grew into a meticulous record, each entry a step closer to unveiling the horror. She discovered that the practice hadn't started with Martin and Zachariah. It stretched back at least 2 generations, with their own parents likely being siblings as well. The family had been deliberately breeding within itself for decades, perhaps longer, each union tightening the noose of genetic ruin. Each generation had produced more damaged children, their bodies and minds bearing the scars of this relentless cycle. Yet instead of stopping the horror, the Fugates had doubled down on it. Rebecca's heart sank as she traced the lineage, her pen trembling over names that looped back on themselves in a grotesque knot. She realized she wasn't looking at ignorant mountain people making tragic mistakes. She was staring at a calculated system, a perverse tradition designed to continue forever, with each generation indoctrined, rinating the next to believe this was the only acceptable way to live. The children were taught to see their suffering as sacred, their pain a testament to family loyalty. Rebecca's candle burned low as she worked, her eyes stinging with fatigue and dread, but she pressed on, driven by the weight of what she'd uncovered. Every malformed child, every stunted mind, was a cry for justice that the Fugates had silenced with threats and lies. She knew her evidence could shatter their carefully guarded secrecy, but the danger of her mission loomed larger with each revelation. To expose the truth was to challenge a legacy fortified by decades of complicity, and Rebecca understood that her quiet work in the shadows might cost her everything she held dear. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. This is where we discover that what Rebecca found wasn't just one twisted family making horrible choices in isolation. It was a deliberate system, a carefully planned operation that had been designed to continue for generations, with rules and traditions passed down like some perverted family heirloom. The Fugate brothers hadn't just married their sisters, they had created a blueprint for their children to follow the same path, and their children's children after that. This wasn't just about preserving family purity, this was about something much darker, much more calculated, something that would make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. Are you ready for that truth? Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And what Rebecca Morrison found in that hidden journal would prove that the real horror was still to come. Rebecca's breakthrough came on a cold October night when she discovered Martin Fugate's private journal, hidden in the false bottom of a medical trunk she was examining. The leather-bound book, its pages brittle and stained, revealed the cold calculation behind what most assumed was merely ignorant mountain behavior. Martin hadn't stumbled into these marriages by accident or clung blindly to tradition. He had studied his family's bloodline with the precision of a scientist, tracking which combinations produced which traits, deliberately choosing matches that would strengthen certain characteristics while accepting the deformities as necessary sacrifices. The journal contained detailed plans for his children's future marriages, all within the family, all designed to preserve what he chillingly termed Fugate purity. Page after page displayed family trees drawn with meticulous care, their branches looping back on themselves in a grotesque tangle. Martin's notes catalogued which siblings displayed the most desirable traits: pale blue skin, specific facial features, while others detailed the defects he deemed acceptable trade-offs: twisted limbs, faltering hearts, minds dulled by genetic ruin. Worst of all were the breeding schedules, planned years in advance with a clinical detachment that made Rebecca's blood run cold. This wasn't madness or ignorance. This was evil disguised as science, horror dressed up as family planning. Martin Fugate had turned his own children into livestock, breeding stock for his twisted vision of genetic perfection. As Rebecca turned the pages, her candle casting flickering shadows across the room, she felt a growing nausea. Each entry was a testament to Martin's obsession, his belief that he could sculpt his family into something eternal, untainted by the outside world. He wrote of purifying the bloodline, as if the suffering children, born with lungs too weak to breathe freely or minds too fractured to learn, were mere steps toward a warped ideal. The journal revealed a man who saw himself as a visionary, not a monster, his calculations devoid of compassion for the lives he shaped. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read, her heart heavy with the weight of what she'd uncovered. This was no isolated tragedy but a deliberate system, a legacy of pain crafted with intent. She knew exposing this journal could unravel the Fugate family's secrets, but it would also draw their wrath. Each word she read deepened her resolve, yet sharpened her fear, for she now held proof of a horror so calculated it defied the simple explanations of tradition or ignorance. Martin's vision was a machine, grinding his own kin into fragments for a dream that would never be whole. The night Rebecca made her escape from the Fugate compound, she carried not just Martin's chilling journal, but photographs she had secretly taken of the most severely affected children, fragile, haunting images of twisted limbs and hollow eyes. Her heart thundered in her chest as she navigated the treacherous mountain trails, the darkness swallowing her path. She knew with bone-deep certainty that if the Fugate brothers discovered what she'd stolen, she would vanish forever into those unforgiving hills, her name erased like so many before her. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, hooves pounding the earth, dogs barking with savage intent, men's voices slicing through the night's eerie silence. She spurred her exhausted horse onward, branches clawing at her clothes and face, leaving trails of blood as she plunged through a dense forest that even seasoned travelers shunned in daylight. The photographs in her saddlebag were her only proof, the journal her sole weapon against a conspiracy that had thrived in secrecy for decades. 3 times that night she crouched in the undergrowth, her breath shallow and ragged, as search parties swept past, their lanterns casting ghostly shadows through the gnarled trees. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig sent her heart lurching, certain they'd found her. By dawn, Rebecca was 15 miles from the compound, her body aching, her horse faltering, yet she pressed on, driven by the weight of the truth she carried. The Fugates were behind her, relentless as wolves tracking a wounded deer, their pursuit fueled by the need to protect their grotesque legacy. The journal's pages, filled with Martin's cold calculations, and the photographs, capturing the children's suffering in stark detail, were a beacon of hope and a death sentence in one. She could still hear the distant baying of hounds, feel the invisible noose of their pursuit tightening. Every step forward was a defiance of the fear that threatened to paralyze her, every mile a testament to her resolve to expose the horrors she'd witnessed. The evidence in her possession could shatter the Fugates' carefully guarded secrets, could bring justice to the children born into pain, but only if she survived the night. Her hands gripped the reins, slick with sweat and blood, as she urged her horse through the fading darkness. The world beyond the mountains waited for her truth, but the Fugates' shadow loomed large, a reminder that her survival hung by a thread as fragile as the lives she sought to save. When Rebecca finally reached civilization, clutching her damning evidence, she discovered a conspiracy so insidious it shook her to her core. The local authorities, who should have recoiled in horror at the atrocities she'd uncovered, were more invested in shielding the Fugate family's tarnished reputation than halting their monstrous crimes. Sheriff Tom Bradley, still fattened by the silver coins he'd pocketed years ago, loomed over her with a sneer, his voice dripping with menace as he dismissed her findings as wild accusations unfit for his town. The town doctor, a man her father had once called a colleague, wouldn't even glance at her photographs or skim Martin Fugate's chilling journal. "These are respected mountain folk," he snapped, slamming his door in her face, as if her evidence were vile slander rather than undeniable truth. "I won't be party to spreading malicious gossip." Even the church, which she'd hoped might offer sanctuary, turned her away with cold disdain. The pastor, the same sanctimonious hypocrite who'd scorned Sarah Jenkins years before, peered at Rebecca's meticulously gathered proof, sketches of deformed children, pages of calculated incest, and declared she suffered from feminine hysteria, her mind warped by too much time dwelling on grotesque medical cases. His words were a slap, a betrayal dressed in pious judgment. Rebecca's heart sank as the truth clawed at her. This conspiracy wasn't just about hiding the Fugate's depravity. It was a fortress of willful blindness, built by a community that chose comfort over confronting the grotesque reality in its midst. The sheriff's corruption, the doctor's cowardice, the pastor's sanctimony. They were all cogs in a machine that propped up the Fugate's horrors, ensuring their twisted legacy endured. This wasn't merely one family's sickness, it was a town complicit in its silence, a system that thrived on denial to avoid the hard labor of justice. Rebecca stood alone, her evidence a burning weight in her hands, surrounded by men who'd sold their integrity to preserve a lie. The children's suffering, those frail bodies, those broken minds, haunted her every step, yet the town turned its back, content to let the Fugate's evil fester in the shadows. She saw now that the battle wasn't just against a family, but against an entire community that had traded its soul for the illusion of respectability. Each door slammed in her face, each whispered dismissal fueled her resolve. Rebecca knew she was up against a wall of complicity, but she would not bend. The truth she carried was a weapon, and she would wield it, no matter the cost. Rebecca's persistence finally paid off when she managed to slip her evidence, a tattered journal and haunting photographs, into the hands of federal marshals investigating other crimes in the region. When the official raid descended on the Fugate compound, it unveiled a chamber of horrors that surpassed even Rebecca's darkest fears. The hidden rooms she had suspected existed, their contents a grotesque gallery that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. Medical journals, meticulously kept, documented decades of deliberate breeding experiments, their cold clinical prose detailing the calculated pairing of siblings. Photographs of children who had succumbed to their genetic deformities were stored like macabre trophies, their lifeless faces frozen in faded images. Detailed records catalogued which family combinations yielded which results. Twisted limbs, failing organs, stunted minds, as if human beings were mere laboratory animals. Most horrifying were the plans for future generations. Breeding schedules stretching years ahead, designed to perpetuate the nightmare indefinitely. The Fugate family hadn't merely practiced inbreeding, they had refined it into a perverse science, perfecting their methods to produce what they deemed desirable traits. Pale, bluish skin, certain facial features, while callously accepting the monstrous consequences. Children too deformed to survive were documented with chilling detachment and discarded. Those who lived were groomed as breeding stock for the next generation, their lives reduced to links in a chain of calculated evil. The scale of this systematic cruelty stunned even seasoned federal investigators, who stood frozen before cabinets filled with evidence of a family's relentless pursuit of a twisted ideal. The journals revealed Martin Fugate's obsession, his educated mind warped into a vision of purity that justified unimaginable suffering. Zachariah's notes detailed psychological tactics to keep the family compliant, breaking their spirits with fear and false devotion. The wives, Elizabeth and Mary, were complicit, selecting mates and silencing dissent, their loyalty forged in a lifetime of conditioning. The compound's walls hid not just bodies but a legacy of deliberate horror, each document a testament to a family that saw itself as above morality. Investigators found rooms stacked with medical tools, restraints and ledgers of births and deaths, the numbers blurring into a litany of loss. The surviving children, frail and broken, were living proof of the record's truth, their existence a silent accusation against a community that had turned away. Rebecca's evidence, once dismissed as hysteria, now stood as an undeniable indictment, exposing a conspiracy that thrived on silence and fear. The marshals, hardened by years of grim work, could barely speak as they uncovered the depths of this abomination. A family not driven by ignorance but by a chilling, calculated ambition to reshape humanity in their own image, no matter the cost. When the full truth about Martin and Zachariah Fugate finally came to light, it revealed men far more dangerous than simple mountain degenerates, men whose calculated cruelty shattered any illusion of rustic ignorance. Martin, the mastermind, had received a formal education in his youth, studying animal husbandry and selective breeding at a state college before turning those cold principles on his own flesh and blood. He wasn't an unlettered farmer stumbling through tradition. He was an educated man who chose to treat human beings like livestock, meticulously sculpting his family's bloodline with a scientist's precision and a tyrant's heart. Zachariah, long dismissed as his brother's shadow, emerged as equally sinister, wielding his own expertise in psychological manipulation. He had devised methods to crush rebellion, weaving a web of fear and devotion that kept family members compliant, convinced their suffering was not only normal, but noble. The brothers had carefully cultivated their public image as simple mountain folk, gruff, hard-working, unassuming, while privately viewing themselves as pioneers in a grotesque experiment of human genetics. Their wives, Elizabeth and Mary, were not mere victims but co-conspirators, groomed from childhood to see their roles as sacred duties. They actively participated in the horror, selecting which children would be bred with whom, their hands steady as they paired siblings to perpetuate Martin's vision. They assisted in covering up the deaths of infants too deformed to survive, disposing of tiny bodies with chilling efficiency, and worked tirelessly to isolate any family member who dared question the family's ways. These were not people driven to desperate acts by poverty or the harshness of mountain life. They were calculated predators who had twisted family love into a weapon of control, wielding it with ruthless intent. Martin's journals, filled with breeding charts and clinical observations, read like the notes of a mad eugenicist, each entry a testament to his obsession with purity. Zachariah's methods, whispered threats, feigned kindness, relentless conditioning, ensured no one broke free from the family's grip. Elizabeth and Mary, far from passive, enforced the silence, their loyalty to the brothers' vision as unyielding as the mountains themselves. Together, they built a fortress of secrecy, manipulating their children into believing their pain was a badge of honor. The Fugate's legacy was no accident, but a deliberate machine of suffering, oiled by ambition and cruelty. As the truth spilled out, it exposed a family not bound by love, but chained by a perverse ideology, one that had turned their home into a laboratory and their kin into specimens for a vision as monstrous as it was meticulous. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a network that reached far beyond the Kentucky hills. The Fugate family hadn't been operating in complete isolation. They had been in contact with similar families across the region, sharing information and even trading children to expand their breeding programs. Letters found in the compound revealed correspondence with families in Virginia, Tennessee, and West Virginia, all practicing the same systematic inbreeding and all supporting each other's efforts to avoid outside detection. Some letters discussed which genetic traits were most valuable, which combinations produced the strongest children, and which methods worked best for keeping victims compliant. Most disturbing were the letters that treated children like commodities, discussing trades and exchanges as if they were livestock. The network had even developed its own code words and symbols, ways of communicating their activities that would be meaningless to outsiders. What had seemed like one isolated family's twisted practices was actually part of a larger conspiracy, a hidden world where human beings were bred like animals for the entertainment and profit of their own relatives. The scope of the horror was almost impossible to comprehend. The conspiracy of silence that had shielded the Fugate family for decades wove its tendrils into every level of society, exposing a rotten system designed to protect predators and abandon their victims to unspeakable suffering. Local officials, their pockets lined with Fugate silver, turned blind eyes to glaring signs of abuse. Deformed children whispered rumors, pleas for help, that never reached beyond the mountain's shadow. Medical professionals, cowed by threats or seduced by bribes, sealed their lips, refusing to acknowledge the grotesque evidence of inbreeding they encountered in their own clinics. Religious leaders, cloaked in sanctimonious piety, chose comfortable lies over the jagged truths that demanded action, preaching forgiveness while ignoring the cries of the innocent. Even federal investigators tasked with upholding justice found their efforts strangled by a web of obstruction. Local allies who cared more for the community's pristine reputation than for stopping heinous crimes that festered in plain sight. Newspapers claiming the story was too disturbing for their delicate readers buried Rebecca Morrison's revelations, printing sanitized snippets or nothing at all, Court records, brimming with accounts of horror, were sealed under the guise of protecting the privacy of surviving victims, ensuring their pain remained invisible. The evidence Rebecca had risked her life to gather, sketches of malformed children, Martin Fugat's chilling journal, was locked away in government vaults, buried where it could no longer tarnish reputations or disrupt the status quo. The message was unmistakable. Some truths are too dangerous to be uttered, some horrors too monstrous to be faced. Society, which loudly proclaimed its duty to protect children and families, had instead labored to keep this nightmare shrouded, prioritizing appearances over humanity. The conspiracy wasn't confined to the Fugates' twisted legacy. It was a broader, more insidious betrayal, a culture that chose willful ignorance over justice, comfort over confrontation, and reputation over the shattered lives of innocent children. Each sealed file, each averted gaze, each whispered dismissal was a brick in the wall that hid the Fugates' atrocities. Rebecca's evidence, her beacon of truth, was smothered by a community that preferred the ease of denial to the hard work of accountability. The children, born into pain, raised to see their suffering as sacred, were betrayed not just by their family, but by a society complicit in its silence. This was no mere failure of justice. It was a deliberate choice to let evil thrive, a stain on a town, a region, a system that valued its own comfort above the cries of those it had sworn to protect. The final fates of the key players in this story reveal the true cost of choosing evil over humanity. Martin Fugate died in federal custody while awaiting trial, officially from a heart attack, but more likely from poison administered by someone who wanted to keep his secrets buried forever. Zachariah lived long enough to face trial, but spent his final years in an asylum, claiming that voices told him his work must continue. Elizabeth and Mary, the sister wives who had enabled decades of horror, disappeared entirely after the raid. Some say they fled to relatives in distant states. Others believe they were killed to prevent them from testifying about the network they'd helped maintain. Dr. Samuel Morrison lost his medical license and spent his remaining years as a broken man, consumed by guilt over his cowardice. Sheriff Tom Bradley quietly resigned and left the county, taking his blood money with him to start over somewhere else. But Rebecca Morrison, the hero who had risked everything to expose the truth, found that heroism comes with its own price. She was blacklisted from medical work, branded as a troublemaker who had destroyed good families with her wild accusations. She lived the rest of her life in poverty, knowing that she had done the right thing and been punished for it by a society that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. The legacy of the Fugate family extends far beyond the victims who suffered directly at their hands, creating ripples of damage that continue to this day. The surviving children, rescued from the compound during the raid, were scattered to different institutions and foster families, but the damage to their bodies and minds could never be fully healed. Many died young from genetic disorders that modern medicine couldn't treat. Others lived longer but struggled with disabilities that made normal life impossible. The few who survived to adulthood carried physical and emotional scars that marked them as different for their entire lives. But perhaps the most lasting damage was to our understanding of how evil can hide behind normal faces, how entire communities can choose to look away when the truth becomes inconvenient. The Fugate case became a study in how systematic abuse can continue for generations when good people decide it's not their problem. It showed us that the most dangerous predators aren't the obvious monsters. They're the ones who look like respected neighbors, who go to church on Sunday and help with the harvest. They're the ones we trust because we need to believe that evil announces itself clearly. The real lesson of the Fugate family is that sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes evil wears a friendly face and asks us to look the other way. As we reach the end of this dark journey together, I want you to think about something that should keep you awake tonight. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? In our age of social media and constant connection, it's easy to believe that such horrors couldn't stay hidden. But remember, the Fugate family operated for decades in a time when communities were smaller and everyone knew everyone else's business. They survived because people chose not to see, chose not to ask questions, chose not to get involved. How many communities today are making the same choice? How many neighbors are looking the other way when they see signs that something isn't right? The Fugate Dynasty of Deformity wasn't just about one twisted family. It was about all the good people who let it happen. If this story has disturbed you the way it should, if it's made you question what might be hiding behind normal faces in your own community, then subscribe to Shadow Stories and join us as we continue to dig into the secrets that powerful people want to keep buried. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Are you brave enough to be part of our investigation? And stay tuned, because next week, we're diving into another story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. The case of the charity that was stealing children and the socialite who helped them do it.